Right.
traits is the most obvious example of this, and we've been calling for this for over a year, and we still do not have it working effectively. And the key part of it is the support part, is the isolation and support. And the people who are unable to isolate and support as a consequence of test and trace are the poorest in society, because they have to go out to work.
And they don't have the money to support what they're being told to do as well.
Yeah, precisely, yeah.
Listen, I'm very sorry we're going to have to leave it there because you've caused a huge sort of ripple and fuss, but thank you for giving an outline of your thoughts. That's Kamran Abbasi, Professor Kamran Abbasi, exec editor of the BMJ, who, as you heard there, deliberately wanted to stir up a hornet's nest, which he's done, with his call for the idea of social murder being charged against governments that haven't carried out their responsibility to protect populations during the pandemic. Thanks to Kamran.
Newsday, BBC World Service. Lawrence and Claire with you. Thank you for joining us today. Our next guest is Nikesh Shikla. He's the author of a new book just published. It's called Brown Baby, a memoir of race, family and home. And he's quoted as saying this: I wrote a book about hope, finding joy in bleak times. It's a letter to my kids about all the stuff that keeps me up at night. I'm delighted to say Nikesh joins us now. Welcome to Newsday. What keeps you up at night then?
What doesn't at the moment? So this is a book about various conversations I've been having with my daughters about things like their skin colour, about climate catastrophe, about grief, about mental health, about the gender and it's the stuff that kind of makes me think I don't know how to navigate these tricky waters. It's very hard to kind of raise them to kind of look at the world and see all of the kind of stuff that isn't God, I'm so inarticulate at 6:50.
Oh, no, it's fine. Well, the big topics you're talking about, they're hard to get your head around, let alone your mouth around. Let's talk about race then, because that is in the title of the book, Brown Baby. You say it's about brownness. You were worried when your daughter refused to play with brown dolls that you bought them, Patty and Mumby. What is your major concern then about how not only your daughters relate to their ethnicity, but how the rest of society looks upon their ethnicity?
Well, my central feeling about it was if they were already at the age of 2 or 3 having certain associations with what it is to be brown, where their association is brown is dirty, then they weren't necessarily going to go into the world feeling proud of who they were, because they are brown children. That is just, they are mixed race children, and they will always be racialized either as mixed race or as as brown, and they aren't white. And I wanted to ensure that they weren't growing up with these negative associations already in their heads, because society is going to make assumptions about them based on what race they are, and I wanted them to feel proud, and so that's what that part of the book comes from. I mean, obviously it may be called Brown Baby, but it's not just a book about race. It's a book about...
but it's, you make such interesting points though about whiteness being the yardstick by which everyone is defined. You're basically saying why, I guess. You're telling your children just be you, but is that quite difficult though in where we are in society right now?
Yeah, of course, because the starting point for them is to be other, and that's the thing that I want to examine. That's the thing I want them to feel we can move forward feeling proud of who we are and not feel other, and because also the other complexity about being mixed races, they're always treated as half of one thing and half of another thing, but actually I want them to see themselves as whole, so but just to stress that it is a book that, while it deals with race and it's through the lens of a brown male, it it is about so much more than that as well.
Well, it is, and there's some beautiful sections, especially the scene after your mother's death. You open a freezer and find food that she has cooked for you. It's a very touching, moving read. We thank you so much for talking to us. Just a few highlights there from Nikesh Chikla's new book, Brown Baby, a memoir of race, family and home.
This is the BBC World Service, looking ahead to World Radio Day.
We may live in the digital age, but only half the world is currently online.
We're off the grid in the middle of the jungles.
Join me, Maria Margaronis, to discover the isolated communities brought together by radio.
One of the main reasons was to keep the Navajo language alive.
Worldwide Waves, Sunday at 14 GMT. And in an hour, Hard Talk with Stephen Sacker.
My guest is Evan Medeiros, President Obama's top advisor on China policy. Under Donald Trump, US-China relations soured dramatically. A potentially dangerous era of competition and even confrontation beckons. So how will Joe Biden handle the China challenge?
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to Newsday in the BBC World Service with Lawrence Pollard and Claire McDonnell.
Hello. Today, demonstrations in central Yangon and Mandalay in Myanmar. Lawyers, civil servants, teachers hoping to lead the country in a general strike against the military's coup last week. We'll hear from a protester in Yangon.
Also today, a second impeachment case against Donald Trump gets underway this week, facing charges of inciting an insurrection. Trump's lawyers say the trial is unconstitutional.
In sports news, we hear how Tom Brady has clinched a remarkable 7th Super Bowl ring with one of his best performances yet.
And also we go back to Belarus and consider 6 months since the mass protests began there against the government of Alexander Lukashenko and what the protesters say was a stolen election. We catch up from Minsk. All that coming up, plus the business as well. That's Newsday.
This is the BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. Hello. Tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets in Myanmar for the third day in a row to protest against last week's military coup. Myanmar's elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi remains in detention. Jonathan Head reports.
By mid-morning, the main road into central Yangon was filled with marching people again, many of them grouped by profession. There were lawyers, civil servants, teachers and engineers in white hard hats. The start, say some protesters, of what they hope will be a general strike across the country. There was also a demonstration by lawyers in Mandalay, the second largest city, and in the capital Naypyidaw, where the coup leaders are based, the police tried but failed to disperse a crowd with water cannon. The massive rallies over the weekend have given new momentum to those opposing last week's coup, but there are still no clear leaders. For now, it's a spontaneous and locally organised show of defiance.
The British government has sought to allay concerns about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, following preliminary research suggesting it was less effective against the South African coronavirus variant. The vaccine's minister, Nadim Zahawi, said the Oxford research team remained confident the jab was effective in preventing severe illness, hospital admissions and deaths from that strain. Here's Fergus Walsh.
The current Pfizer and Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines work well against the dominant strain here in the UK, but there is concern about how much the South Africa variant may be spreading in the community. Over 100 cases have been identified, and other new variants are inevitable as the virus mutates. New vaccine technology means it is quick and simple to tweak COVID jabs. Scientists in Oxford are working on several updated vaccines, including ones against the South Africa and Brazil variants. Coronavirus mutates more slowly than flu, so it's too early to tell how often people would need a booster jab.
The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is due to return to court to enter his plea to charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust. Yolan Nell is in Jerusalem.
This will be Mr. Netanyahu's second appearance in court since the start of his trial last May. Back then, noisy crowds supporting and opposing him gathered outside, and in a hallway flanked by ministers from his party, he addressed TV cameras to profess his innocence and say he was being framed. There's expected to be less political drama as Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister now formally responds to the charges in 3 cases that involve him receiving gifts from millionaire friends and allegedly seeking regulatory favours for media tycoons in return for positive news coverage.
Yolan Nell. You're listening to the World News from the BBC. Australia's Foreign Minister Marise Payne says the Australian journalist Chung has been formally arrested in China on suspicion of illegally supplying state secrets overseas. Chung worked as a high-profile presenter for China's state-run English-language news service, CGTN. She was detained in August last year. British lawyers assessing human rights abuses against the Uyghur people have said there's a very credible case that the Chinese government is committing genocide. The lawyers from London were instructed by Uyghur and human rights groups to evaluate publicly available evidence. They said the deliberate infliction on harm on Uyghurs in the region of Xinjiang, the forcible transfer of children, and measures preventing women from giving birth could amount to genocide. The centre-left candidate Andrés Arauz has come first in Ecuador's presidential election, with just over 30% of the vote. It's not yet clear who he will face in the runoff. With most of the votes counted, the indigenous leader Yaku Perez and the conservative Guillermo Lasso are still competing for second place, with almost 20% each. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have beaten the Kansas City Chiefs by 31 points to 9 to win the Super Bowl. They were led to victory in their own stadium by the veteran quarterback Tom Brady, who claimed the 7th championship of his career. The triumph will cement Brady's legacy as perhaps the greatest quarterback in the history of American football. After the game, he paid tribute to his team.
This has been an amazing year. We got off to a good start, 7-2, and then had a little rough stretch where we kind of found our identity and played a lot better football down the last December, January. Just really proud of all the guys, proud of all the coaches, the effort we put in. We knew we were playing a great football team tonight, and we got the job done. So you want to get this far, you got to get the job done, and we did it.
BBC News.
Hello, welcome back. It's Newsday from the BBC World Service. Claire McDonnell and Lawrence Pollard, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up, the people on the streets. It's just started in Myanmar, from where we hear in just a moment. It's been going on for 6 months in Belarus. We'll get an update from Minsk. We're talking Trump again. The second impeachment this week. It gets underway tomorrow. Business News with Andrew Wood in Hong Kong looks at the president's line on China, and we'll bring you more on, of course, the Super Bowl, that victorious win for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Tom Brady. James Gregg will be here with all the sports news. You can keep up with us on Twitter and on Facebook as well. Just look for BBC World Service. You can post your comments on our lead stories there. And if there's anything you hear on the programme and you want to get involved, you can text myself and Lawrence as well. This is the number you need, +44 77 86 20 50 85.
It's lunchtime in Myanmar at the moment, and the protesters are back in the streets after tens of thousands of people massed in Yangon and other cities over the weekend in demonstrations against the removal and detention of Aung San Suu Kyi, along with her former colleagues. She was taken into custody as the military seized power in a coup last week. Internet access is restored after being blocked, but these are dramatic scenes despite the danger or the risk that many of the people are taking. We've managed to speak to one of the protesters briefly who was involved in these. We had a rather poor telephone line, so we voiced over his comments. We're calling him Lin.
All the young people came out from their homes, and they are against the military coup. And then yesterday, more people, bigger than the first day. Today, since early morning, the people came out from their homes, and some industry workers came out of their working places. They didn't go to their jobs. And now people are gathering on the streets, walking around major cities. And we want the release of all the detained people.
Do you think the protests are getting bigger?
Yes, sure.
And are particular groups coming out? Is it students? Is it the unemployed? Who is coming out and protesting?
We can say a general strike because not only ordinary people, also teachers and health workers have joined with the people.
And do you fear violence? In the past, the government, the military, has behaved brutally towards protesters. Are you afraid for how you will be treated?
For the violence for the military I have experienced from 2007. This time I am not afraid, because this federation of people is bigger than 2007, and because people are fighting the military coup not only in Rangoon, but also in every area of Burma.
That's Lin, as you heard, a veteran demonstrator going back years, actually, he says, with all the dangers that they have to suffer. Gathering strength of the protests, he's claiming, on behalf of the many people who've taken to the streets, and strikes happening in several sectors of the economy as well. Thanks to Lee for speaking to us.
Former BBC Burmese editor Tin Ta Sway here in London. We're looking at these pictures. I mean, quite disturbing pictures of protesters on the receiving end of water cannon from riot police. But, you know, we have details of the people out in the streets. They're lawyers, they're engineers, they're teachers, they're monks. It's a huge cross-section of society, a real civil disobedience movement. Is this different from the last time round, do you think?
And different in the way the strikes are organizing, I would say, because the aim today is the aim by the young activists. What they're trying to do is to stop all the government organs, from functioning, and that is the aim. By doing so, they feel that it will, when it stops functioning, the military government will have to make concessions. So that is the aim, and they seems to be pretty successful with what they intend to do today, because as just now, as the news said, everybody was out, even the office workers and factory workers.
We were hearing, though, from a human rights representative with people on the ground in Myanmar was saying, well, on the university campus, it seems that the military, there is some movement there where they have pretty extensive caches of arms. I mean, this is the worry, I suppose, that it starts off as a peaceful protest, and he was saying that's very much what this is all about. But that peaceful raising of their voices may not be met with such a peaceful response from the military.
Given what happened in Burma or Myanmar before, it's quite likely, the military will use force. But what is interesting now is the security. The protesters are outnumbering the security forces. It's happening all over the country, not just in the main capital, Rangoon or Naypyidaw. It's happening everywhere. So how are they going to counter the protesters? No, you can't use force. They don't, unless they have enough resources, unless they call the army in, it would be difficult to crack down on the protesters.
What's the next move then, do you think? I mean, presumably, that the resistance will be met with resistance. It is already being met with resistance from riot police using water cannon on protesters. But, we're seeing these protests across the country. Is this a resistance movement that can have some change within Myanmar, or does the international community need to be more forceful in its words of support and potentially threats of sanctions as well for the military regime that's in power now to shift position?
What is interesting at the moment is the people inside the country. Previously, in the previous protests, they were hoping the international community support could change the minds of the military dictators, but that was not the case. So they decided now they should take the matters in their own hand by going out into the street and to protest. At the same time, they are hoping that international community put more pressure on the military, the coup leaders. They are hoping UN would be a bit more forceful in demanding to restore democracy in the country. So they are approaching, I would say it's a kind of two-pronged approach by the protesters, but they're not going to stop. According to the young activists, they said they're not going to stop. They will just keep on protesting until the military meet their demands, and their demand is to restore democracy.
We were hearing that the, General Min Kwang, who is in charge right now, having seized power last week, was going to make a speech or has made a speech. What are you hearing on that front?
Nothing. We were told that he might be giving a speech today, but we're not sure whether he would give a speech today. But the military has to acknowledge is the military, its role in the democratic transition. Its role is there is a perceived lack of acknowledgement of its role. They are going back to 33 years ago, where they took power by force and then run the country for another 3-4 decades. They have to, now people want them to acknowledge its role in the democratic transition and ensuring national security. And also, General Min Aung Hlaing, initially, I think he had this political ambition by removing Aung San Suu Kyi, by making her disqualified to contest in further elections. That will give him enough room to remain in this position as head of the government, head of state. But now he is realizing that might not be the case, because the people are out there and the people are solidly behind Aung San Suu Kyi. But not only that, the people are now taking the matters in their own hand, which is a new, it is a different challenge to General Min Aung Hlaing.
Okay, we will see what their next tactic is then. Thank you for the update. Thousands of people on the streets across Myanmar this morning, a lot of them wearing hard hats in white and yellow. The BBC Burmese editor, Tin Ta Sway, thank you for joining us.
We haven't spoken much about Donald Trump lately, have we? Maybe you've missed it, and you're in luck, because this week the second impeachment trial officially begins, on Tuesday, in fact. The charge is inciting insurrection. It's the Democrats who are pushing the case in Senate. And they, of course, have to learn lessons from the failure to impeach when Mr. Trump was still president. It's all over, of course, the deadly 6th of January riot at the US Capitol, which left 5 people dead. Mr. Trump has said he won't be testifying at the trial. His lawyers say you can't impeach a retired official. So what could happen? How did we get here? Paul Adams reports.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are...
And so, here we go again, for the second time in a year.
While the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States
an article of impeachment against Donald John Trump.
2 weeks ago, the charges were laid out by the former president's Democratic accusers. Congressman Jamie Raskin said Donald Trump's high crimes and misdemeanors began right after November's election.
President Trump repeatedly issued false statements asserting that the presidential election results were the product of widespread fraud.
You can't ever accept when they steal and rig and rob. This is an embarrassment to our country.
That was a rigged election.
That effort, shrill and relentless, went on until January the 6th, when Congress gathered in Washington to certify the results.
Shortly before the joint session commenced, President Trump addressed a crowd at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C.
We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about.
He also willfully made statements that in context encouraged and foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol, such as,
if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Within minutes of those words, some of the president's supporters were storming into the Capitol building. But the charges against Mr. Trump don't stop there. He's also accused of trying to subvert and obstruct confirmation of the election results, famously in a phone call to officials in Georgia on January the 2nd.
Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
At times, the president seemed almost threatening.
And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk.
So alarmed were Georgia Republican officials about the president's wild public accusations that one of them, Gabriel Sterling, had already warned a month earlier of the possible consequences.
Stop inspiring people to commit potential acts of violence. Someone's going to get hurt, someone's going to get shot, someone's going to get killed.
But did Donald Trump actually incite violence? America's First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech, sets a very high bar.
You cannot be punished for speech, even if you're advocating lawlessness or the overthrow of the government or violence.
Katie Fallow is a lawyer at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University.
Unless, in a very narrow category, you show that that speech is intended to incite imminent lawlessness or violence and is likely to incite lawlessness or violence. And it has to be imminent.
So is that what Donald Trump was doing on January the 6th? Republicans like Kentucky Senator Rand Paul are scathing.
This sham of an impeachment will ostensibly ask whether the president incited the reprehensible behavior and violence of January 6th, when he said, I know everyone here
will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Peacefully and patriotically. Hardly words of violence.
Square that with the views of his Kentucky colleague, Mitch McConnell, the most powerful Republican in Congress.
The mob was fed lies. They were provoked by the president and other powerful people.
For a while, it seemed Mr. McConnell might actually support impeachment. But when Rand Paul forced a vote on the constitutionality of the trial, McConnell and the overwhelming majority of Republicans joined him. Senator Paul said the trial was now dead on arrival. It is still going to happen. The House managers have already walked the articles over to the Senate. Arguments have been lodged. The process has begun. To survive the Russia investigation and impeachment twice, well, who knows what Mr. Trump would make of that.
Paul Adams on impeachment number 2.
Newsday, BBC World Service. Lawrence and Claire with you. Let's now take a look at the sports news. Here's James Gregg.
He's still the greatest of all time. Tom Brady outdueled Patrick Mahomes to win record 7th Super Bowl and first since signing with the Bucs as Tampa Bay upset the defending champions Kansas City Chiefs 31 points to 9. It wasn't even close overnight. He's 2 decades and 346 games into the most successful career in NFL history. But Tom Brady still isn't finished winning Super Bowls. The 43-year-old extended his record to win his 7th, like I said, the 7th Super Bowl crown on Sunday. He truly is one of the most astonishing sports people ever. Elsewhere, Morocco's triumph in the African Nations Championship means that they're the first side to win back-to-back titles as they beat Mali on Sunday 2-0. Have Liverpool blown the Premier League title? I think so. 10 points off the pace now after they got thumped 4-1 by Manchester City at Anfield yesterday. England's cricketers have chosen not to enforce the follow-on against India in Chennai. They lead by 270 runs, having bowled India out for 3-3-7. And no shocks yet at the start of the Aussie Open tennis. I'll be talking to South African star Kevin Anderson in about 20 minutes' time here on the Newsday.
I am just reading a shock, though, at the Australian tennis, James. Unseeded Bernarda Pera kicking out 3 Grand Slam title-winning Angelique Kerber. Just dropped in the last couple of minutes.
Well, there we go. That's the first shock of the tournament, and it won't be the last either. It won't be the last, Claire.
Wow, what a scalp. More from James coming up in around about half an hour's time. It's Newsday, BBC World Service. We're going to bring you up to speed with business news now. Crossing to Hong Kong on our business desk is Andrew Wood. Now, let's talk about Joe Biden, President Joe Biden. He had a first TV interview after the inauguration, and he was saying in this interview last night, it aired across the States, that the US doesn't need to have conflict with China, but there will be what he calls extreme competition economically. Give us the details of what he was saying, Andrew.
Yeah, well, I think, to be honest, there's already pretty intense competition between China and the United States economically. Mr. Biden, I beg your pardon, didn't give a lot of details, but he did say that he's not going to be following President Trump's examples. He's not going to be using President Trump's tactics. And he said that that America would be playing by the rules. And I think that's probably a hint there that we get a hint of that from what happened at the weekend. The United States backed Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala to be the first female and the first African, she's from Nigeria, the first African to be the head of the World Trade Organization. Previously, President Trump had gone against the consensus and backed her rival from South Korea. So that's a sign, I think, that America is taking the WTO seriously again, and hopefully it's a place where where trade disputes can be worked out.
And it is a decade, isn't it, Andrew, since China overtook Japan to become the world's second biggest economy. So what is the thinking about, potentially it overtaking the United States to become the world's biggest economy?
Well, if you extend the lines on the graphs of their their economic trajectories, it seems that some people are now saying the end of the decade, 2028, 2029. But if that seems to be the consensus at the moment, and that seems to have got a bit quicker actually, because don't forget the American economy suffered far more from coronavirus than China has. People are also saying that, well, if you look at if the Chinese currency continues to appreciate and the dollar stays low, when you do all the calculations, it could be as early as 2026, perhaps, that China overtakes America. But don't forget, they're very different economies. China has a lot more people, and so the amount of economically that each Chinese person produces compared to each American is far, far lower. I mean, China at the moment is sort of between Costa Rica and Malaysia in how much each Chinese person produces economically.
Andrew, thank you.
It's coming up to 25 minutes past the hour. Now let's go to Belarus. We've been talking about the street demonstrations in Myanmar, which have become ever stronger over the weekend, but they're only in day 3 or 4. 6 months people have been demonstrating in Belarus. This weekend marked that. It was called a Day of Solidarity with the people of Belarus who have been demonstrating against Alexander Lukashenko and the vote in August to re-elect him, widely condemned as fraudulent. Lucia Chesky is the Moscow correspondent of the Swiss public broadcaster SRF News, and she was in Minsk. Joins us on the line now, and I gather you were roughed up. I mean, the protests are still going on. Give us an update about how they've evolved, would you?
Well, the protests are not visible outside on the streets, as they've been during the first months after falsified presidential elections. But nevertheless, all people I talked to in Belarus were as convinced of their resistance towards the current regime as they have ever been since August. So the repression by the regime is at the very moment not targeted at people participating in any form of protest. People are caught randomly on the streets by plainclothes policemen. And I have been an eyewitness to this myself.
Ah, right. So that's their tactics. Does it actually stop people going to the streets? I mean, it is, of course, we should say, it must be absolutely freezing. So it's not, these 6 months ago is August. It's very different demonstrating in August in Minsk and demonstrating now.
Well, of course, at the very moment, the temperature is so low that, of course, it has been minus 23 during the last few days, and in the upcoming days it will minus 29. But I can tell you from what I have witnessed myself that just going outside, just leaving your house is a danger in Belarus right now, because one just can get caught by these plainclothes policemen, and one can get arrested for several days in a detention center under horrendous
So tell us what you've seen, because I know a lot of the protesters we've spoken to has said there's a certain amount of safety in numbers, isn't there? When there's a lot of demonstrators together, they feel safe, but it's the individuals who get picked off. What have you seen?
Well, I was just on my way getting a cup of coffee with a friend of mine, Anicia, and her husband, Yuli. And while we were waiting at the zebra crossing for the lights to turn green, a black minivan stopped in front of us, and several men in black masks were running towards us and telling us to come with them. They did not at any point identify themselves, and it was a terrifying situation. I told them very loudly in Russian that I was a citizen of Switzerland and that I had all the necessary documents on me. They did not care to listen, but just dragged me in that black minivan with my friends.
And you were waiting at a traffic crossing. That was what you were doing. There was no... I mean, is your friend identifiably an activist? Is she known to the security forces?
Well, known to security forces are most probably most of the citizens of Belarus, but I would say no, we were just standing there at this crossing, and we were, there was no protest around us. The streets were empty. It was a really quiet Sunday afternoon in Minsk. And besides us, there was just really no one outside. And I think they just got, from the top at the morning, most probably, they heard that, today we need to catch around 100 people. And as there were no protests outside, they just called us.
Right. OK, they have their quotas to do. In terms of the protests 6 months on, very briefly, are they going to carry on, do you think, when the weather changes as well?
This is what people told me in Belarus, that they are planning to go back to the streets when spring comes back and when the weather is better. And, because the conditions at the very moment are really tough for protesting outside on the street.
Lucia, many, many thanks indeed. Lucia Chersky, now back in Moscow from Minsk, Moscow correspondent of the Swiss Public Broadcaster.
This is the BBC World Service, where musicians from around the world share their lives in music.
Community. There's such an amazing, diverse group of people from countries back home that we just take inspiration from each other. Culture.
So many different kinds of genres that are from the UK, from London.
Comparison. Then you play it back, it's just numbers. And then you play it to somebody else, they hear colours. Yeah, mad. How do these come into play when we create? I'm Liz LeBega. I'm a British-born Ugandan singer-songwriter. I'll be joined by 3 other British musicians with African backgrounds. RK, Intellect, and Tiny Man.
One of the biggest challenges is being able to keep the fire burning and say, today I'm an artist and I'm going to love making music.
Together, we're discussing how comparison to others, culture, and community all affect our lives in music. Being around the people, that's where kind of like my self-doubt can go away in an instant.
Music Life, Saturday at 12 and Sunday at 20 GMT.
Hello, welcome. You're listening to Newsday on the BBC World Service. Thanks for joining us. Lawrence Pollard and Claire McDonald with you.
South African government stops the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine rollout in the country after scientists there say it offers less protection.
Thousands of people who've been have fled fighting in Mali are in urgent need of food, according to aid organisations.
And Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf will be talking on moulding tomorrow's female leaders.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. Tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets in Myanmar for the 3rd day in a row to protest against last week's military coup. In the main city of Yangon, many were grouped by profession, including lawyers, teachers and civil servants, a precursor to a possible general strike. In the capital Naypyidaw, police used water cannon to try to disperse protesters. The British government has sought to allay concerns about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, following a preliminary study which suggested it was less effective against the South African coronavirus variant. The vaccines minister said the Oxford research team remained confident the jab was effective in preventing severe illness from that strain. The authorities in Haiti have detained more than 20 people they accuse of planning to overthrow President Jovenel Moïse. Opposition leaders have condemned the arrests. They argue that the president's term has come to an end, but he insists he has another year to go. Australia's Foreign Minister says the Australian journalist Chung has been formally arrested in China on suspicion of illegally supplying state secrets overseas. Chung worked as a high-profile presenter for China's state-run English-language news service, CGTN. She was detained 6 months ago. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has arrived in court to enter his plea to charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust, his second appearance since the trial started last May. He's denied offering favours to media companies in exchange for positive coverage. And the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have beaten the Kansas City Chiefs by 31 points to 9 to win the Super Bowl. They were led to victory in their own stadium by the veteran quarterback, Tom Brady. And that's the latest BBC News.
And many thanks indeed for the latest. Hello, this is Newsday with Claire and Lawrence. We're hoping to get reaction from South Africa about their decision about the delayed rollout of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Also guest this morning is the former Liberian President Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf. And also we'll be hearing what the dark web is doing during the pandemic. It's a main market for all sorts of stuff, COVID-related. We speak to a researcher who's been looking into that. All that and James Gregg with a lot of sport.
Let's start this half hour, though, in Mali, because thousands of people there are in urgent need of aid after fleeing a spike in airstrikes and clashes between armed groups. Aid workers from the organisation Islamic Relief, who are on the ground, say that food supplies are running out and some of the displaced families have not eaten for days. Children are at high risk now of malnutrition. It's a pretty desperate situation. Let's get a view from the ground with Moussa Traoré, Islamic Relief's country director, who joins us now. Welcome to Newsday, Moussa. What can you tell us then about how things have escalated on the ground there?
Hello, thank you very much. I am Moussa Traoré, the country director of Islamic Relief in Mali. As you know, Mali experienced a multi-dimensional crisis since 2012. The humanitarian impact of which is still being felt by the population. Notably, we observe a huge population movement.
And I'm reading, I'm just going to say, Moussa, I'm reading that a lot of people who've been displaced are nomads, many of them having to sleep outside in the open air under makeshift tents in very, very difficult conditions right now. Tell us more about that.
Yes, of course, those who fly their home, they did not get chance to carry anything with them. So, and where they are sitting, like as IDPs, they are lacking they lack in everything, like food, and they have to reduce, to adopt poor coping mechanism in terms of food. They don't have a shelter. Most of them are using poor temporary shelter, using old clothes to protect, to try to build a poor hut. So they are exposed to this period. It is very cold in the country in the night, especially in the region of North. So they are exposed to that cold in the night, and the wind. Wind is very is in the area of north. There is the big wind also. So
right, I know, and it exposes people to the risk of pneumonia. I'm reading, because obviously the high wind and the temperature drops at night, and there's many children here, more than 10,000 people we're talking to, fleeing their homes in the Timbuktu and Mopti region, which is in central Mali. So you're launching this appeal, aren't you, to raise funds to provide emergency aid. How much do you need, and how will it be used?
For the time being, the assessment has been carried out, and the emergency needs communities are mainly food, shelter, NFI, wash kits. Okay, they are also in need of protection. So, for the time being, humanitarian actors has limited access to resources that make that the positioning is still expected. It's more than 10,000 people, of course, has been registered as IDPs in that area. For the time being, Islamic Relief succeeded to mobilize limited resources and to provide assistance to certain IDPs in terms of food and in terms of shelter. So still, there is big need to address, and this is the message so that for international community to support humanitarian actors in terms for them to have access to resources in order to provide support to those IDPs. And I am anticipate to report that the movement of population is still ongoing. New communities has been reported so far.
It's certainly a situation that needs help immediately. Moussa Traoré, thank you for joining us, outlining what's going on in Mali now with thousands of displaced people at great risk of malnutrition. He is the Islamic Relief's country director there.
We've been talking a lot also, haven't we, about the humanitarian disaster affecting millions of people in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. The United Nations is raising the alarm of the risk of atrocity crimes in Ethiopia, not only Tigray, but elsewhere. The UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide is Alice Wairimu Nderitu. And she says that she's received very concerning reports of human rights violations and abuses by all parties to the conflict in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region and elsewhere. I've been speaking to Ms. Nderitu.
We have reports of escalation of ethnic violence across Ethiopia, allegations of grave and distressing human rights abuses, including extrajudicial executions, sexual violence, looting of property, arbitrary arrests, killings, rape, displacement of population, and destruction of property, hate speech, and stigmatization, including ethnic profiling. Just last week, the Secretary General of the UN called for urgent steps to alleviate the humanitarian situation and extend the necessary protection to those at risk. And in November, my office had expressed deep concern over reports of escalating ethnic tensions in Ethiopia. So you can see the build-up of events that has prompted us to speak out at this particular time.
There are also warnings of famine as well. All these issues intersect, of course. Are you able to get information out of Tigray?
We are able to get information out of Tigray, but in terms of the numbers, that will be best answered by my humanitarian colleagues in the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees. In Tigray, at this particular time, it hasn't helped. Eastern Africa had the invasion of locusts. And then now, at this particular time, of course, with war, impossible to harvest. So there are situations of people who are hungry, who are suffering, and we have humanitarian actors on the ground giving support to them.
And if the conflict is defined by at least one side as ethnically based, Tigray and Tigrayan people versus everyone else, then the rhetoric and the direction of travel would seem to point towards the worst possible outcome, wouldn't it?
Actually, the statement that we put out was very specific on speaking to the whole of Ethiopia. We were not speaking about just the Tigray region itself. Although the fighting is going on and it's very intense and has been very intense in Tigray. But we also have reports from other areas, like surrounding towns, where fighting has happened between federal forces and the TPLF and affiliated militias on both sides. So we are speaking to the whole country.
There are also reports of Eritrean government involvement, particularly in Tigray. Do you speak to Eritrean sources at all?
No, I haven't spoken to the Eritreans, and I have no evidence that the Eritreans have been involved.
But you would look into those reports and you would take them seriously, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely, we would.
And just as a final point, what do you want the world community to do about this? You've raised the alarm, but where's the fire engine?
We know that from experience, atrocity crimes do not happen overnight. There are processes with root causes and triggers. And right now, what we need is for the Ethiopian government to establish rule of law and an impartial and independent investigation to be held and ensure accountability for serious violations.
And so far, has your alarm, raising the alarm, which is your very important role, do you feel that you're being listened to?
Yes, it is being listened to. I've had several calls. I've spoken to several people, including Ethiopian officials. It's so important that we speak about these things. It's so important that we put out these issues. My office is the focal point, for example, on hate speech and can offer assistance, and we've offered this assistance. And we know that hate speech has been a big problem in Ethiopia, and it's so important at this particular time for us as the UN to step up and address these challenges. The international community also has a responsibility to assist national authorities in protecting its populations. And my primary focus is prevention. I do not determine whether genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity have occurred, but rather I focus on early prevention.
Well, that's Alice Wairimu Nderitu, the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. Obviously gravely worried about serious reports coming out of Ethiopia and Tigray in particular of atrocities on the civilian population. It's 18 minutes to the hour. This is Newsday from the BBC World Service. Sport in a moment, but first let's go to South Africa and talk more about the decision by the authorities there to halt the rollout of the AstraZeneca vaccine. We were covering last week its arrival. The first 1 million doses arrived at Joburg Airport, welcomed by the President himself. But now the rollout has been halted, at least for now. Let's speak to to Professor Tullio de Oliveira, epidemiologist from the Nelson R. Mandela School of Medicine at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who's closely followed the spread and the nature of the South African variant and also its increased infectiousness. Professor, welcome back to the programme. Do you support the delay in the rollout in this case?
Yes and no. Yes. So what it means, the first thing is that the government, it seems that they're gonna continue the rollout, which the first group to receive the vaccine was the healthcare workers, but they decided to, instead of using the AstraZeneca, to use the Johnson & Johnson from the healthcare workers. So what we understand is that the rollout will continue next week, especially for the key groups in South Africa.
And can they actually get hold of supplies of the Johnson & Johnson? Because I gather the supplies are not as plentiful as the AstraZeneca, am I right?
Yes, so there is two things about the Johnson & Johnson. One, that they're gonna run a lot of the initial vaccinations as what they call implementation research. So that's a fast-track process, and they're gonna follow very close the results of that. And the second is that this vaccine can also potentially be co-produced in South Africa because they have some plans of the Johnson & Johnson. Of course, that the results for the AstraZeneca also has been in the Oxford vaccine. It has to be looking more details because in South Africa was a small trial, a trial of 2A and 2B, which only followed 2,000 individuals with mild and medium infection. And what I think is that probably the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine will increase also the trial size in South Africa, so we can see what's the effect of this vaccine, especially on severe disease, which the current study that was led by Wits University together with Oxford, they didn't have any case of severe disease in South Africa, neither in the placebo or the vaccine arm.
Wouldn't that seem to be the most important thing? Because if it is effective, as the makers appear to suggest, if it is effective in extreme cases, if people get it really bad, then surely it's still worth rolling out, isn't it?
Yes, and that it is exactly our hope, is that in despite of the very low efficacy on a small phase 2 trial in South Africa on the mild infections, that we would still see some efficacy on severe infections, especially as the neutralization, it was not very different from the Novavax, which did show a reduced efficacy in the South Africa, but it's still high enough, was 60%.
So the rollout should continue, you think, should it, of the AstraZeneca, briefly?
I think that the government, they have what it's called a Ministerial Advisory Committee on vaccines, and it's very similar to SAGE in the UK, and they're going to be meeting a few times this week to come with a very careful plan, because we were all very excited with the Oxford AstraZeneca to have arrived in the country, and now I think that we have just to carefully continue this crucial research, but also to discuss with the government what will be the best use for these vaccines.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for joining us, Professor Tullio de Oliveira of the University of KwaZulu-Natal.
And let's get you updated on all the sports headlines today. Here's James Craig.
You know that traditionally the Australian Open tennis is played in January, but this time round it was pushed back 3 weeks to enable players, coaches and officials to go through a really strict coronavirus quarantine on arrival in Australia. The build-up to the tournament has, though, been mired in controversy after stricter restrictions were imposed on 72 competitors. That was following COVID-19 cases on 3 of the charter flights that were bound for the competition. There was then further disruption this week when 160 players were told to isolate. That was pending a negative coronavirus test. That was after one of the security guards at one of the hotels where they were quarantined tested positive. Well, I've been speaking to 2-time Grand Slam finalist, current world number 92, And rather more importantly, the ATP Players Council President, Kevin Anderson. I spoke to him a few hours ago, and he gave me a great insight into the preparations and build-up from his perspective.
I mean, obviously, it's been a very tricky situation, and I think, first and foremost is to really recognize and appreciate the efforts that Australia have gone to and, the way they've approached to keeping the virus under control. And, with their very hard lockdowns, it's resulted in almost zero cases, in their community. And I think they've, really had to protect that. And hosting the Australian Open was taken, as you said, a lot of the logistics and the security measures and restrictions were all imposed by the Victorian government, nothing to do with Tennis Australia. And I can really understand that. It's, it's been a very difficult topic, but I hope that we've sort of moved past the that sort of difficult early period, and now we can really focus on having the Australian Open, which I know players love. It's one of their favorite tournaments throughout the year, and I know that the community and the public really love this tournament as well. From the player side, obviously, especially those who are in the hard lockdown, I think just from a purely professional standpoint, obviously it's quite difficult to be in your room for 2 weeks after training for months on end and then having to come out and compete. So that was very unfortunate, but the public safety and the people's health has to come before that, and that's why those restrictions were put in place.
Ultimately, it's going to be a brilliant tournament. What do you expect in terms of, from the organisers, what is the best possible outcome for them? Because we know that it's been so much work to put on, and it is just a miracle that there's actually a brilliant Grand Slam tennis tournament to be looking forward to, particularly for viewers around the world, all around the globe. Obviously, people are going to be tuning in and watching and seeing how their favourite players are getting on. But what is the best possible? Have they already achieved that by the fact that the tournament is going to get underway and start? Is that the best possible outcome, would you say?
Well, I think it's been a big step forward to get to this point, but no, I think having a successful tournament here is one that we really need to, make sure that players, staff, organisers, everybody still follows protocols to keep everybody healthy. I think that's going to be most important. And then, afterwards, just hopefully, I think the best outcome is to leave this tournament with a really good feeling that, through all these challenges, the Australian Open still has been able to, go through. It's such an important event. It's, both from tennis players who, as I said, really love coming here. And I think it's such an important event, here in Melbourne with such strong and passionate fans. And, I feel like if we can get through this, it's not going to be the same in terms of crowd numbers. There are restrictions, but I'd say no more cases, and just really good sentiment both from players and everybody involved, and also sort of within the community as well.
Kevin, absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for talking to the BBC World Service. Much appreciated, and all the best for the tournament.
Of course, anytime. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks to Kevin. He plays 9th seed Matteo Berrettini tomorrow. Tough ask for him. He's unseeded. The tournament is underway. Serena is through. Angelique Kerber is out. You can follow that and all the rest about the Super Bowl and everything else online as ever at bbc.com/sport.
James, thank you very much indeed. Now, here's a question. How do you get more women into positions of leadership? It's something most people want to see happen, something which most organisations aspire to. Well, former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is doing something about it to give women more than a fighting chance in leadership across Africa. For the past 2 years, she has been running her own Centre for Women and Development, and we've been checking in with her on a regular basis here on Newsday. Delighted to say Ellen Johnson Sirleaf joins us now. Welcome back to Newsday. Great to have you on the programme. Your new intake has just begun. So going into year 2, how's it looking?
It's looking very good. We're very pleased with the progress to date as we go to celebrate our first year anniversary just 1 month from now. As you know, we just introduced to the world these 15 dynamic women from 11 African countries, all in advanced stages in terms of the pursuit of their leadership goals. And we're so proud that they joined the previous 15 of last year. And as we all have been struck with COVID-19, they have not ceased to continue to progress because they've started through their networking and the platform they established. They're addressing the effects of COVID by getting into communities and doing what they can to ensure that people observe the protocols of wearing masks, ensuring social distancing, and all of that. So we're very pleased with the progress, and we're pleased with their advisors, advisors like Okonjo Iweala, who will be heading the WHO, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who's now going to be the U.S. representative to the United Nations, Dr. Joyce Banda, former president of Malawi. It's taken off beyond our expectations, and so we're very pleased.
It's fantastic to bring women in, because these are already women who've excelled in their fields, whether it's working or with refugee rights or gender equality or youth empowerment. Once you get them in and once you get them used to that political world, though, they're up against a lot, aren't they? We interview female politicians a lot on Newsday here on BBC World Service who, they might get into government, but then the cards are so stacked against them, it's very difficult for them to make any further change. How can we change that?
You're absolutely right in that the systemic barriers that continue to keep women from reaching the highest pinnacle of there, we have to keep challenging it. We have to keep working together. We must also bring some men into this, recognizing the role that women play, the contribution of women to development, and what women have demonstrated. Just look at the COVID-19. It's been strong women leaders that have really managed the transmission, have really gone right out in the front line and taken action to be able to control this virus.
Listen, it's always a delight to talk to you. Time is against us, sadly. Wish we had longer, but we don't. But fantastic. We will get regular updates from you as this project goes forward. Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, thank you for joining us here on Newsday.
Now, the COVID pandemic has reshaped the demand for goods and services worldwide, and that goes for the dark web as well. By dark web, we basically mean the shadow underground web, and a new study from academics at London City University has been looking at what exactly has happened. One of the researchers is Andrea Baroncelli, who joins us now. Andrea, this is interesting because we've seen huge changes in demands in the way that we shop in the real world. In the dark web, what happened, therefore, when coronavirus hit or when vaccinations started? What changes have you noticed?
Well, good morning, first of all, and thank you for having me here. We found that the dark markets, and dark markets are basically online trade websites in the dark web, pretty much alike the ones we are used to in the normal web. And what we found is that they have been, and they still are, particularly reactive to shocks in the traditional economy, shortages, as you said, and to public attention. So there is this double nature. And two examples clarify this. At the beginning, if you remember 1 year ago, or slightly less than 1 year ago in Europe, there were shortages of PPEs, gloves, masks, this kind of stuff, hand sanitizer. And the dark web started selling massive quantities of these goods. Then as the pandemic progressed and we started finding masks in normal shops, the offer there decreased, but the market started reacting to, for example, misinformation on medicines.
Trying to take advantage of that?
Yeah, definitely. So dark web is really, the dark markets in particular, is really where misinformation becomes a threat to public health.
So if I wanted to buy hydroxychloroquine or something like that, that's where I would look. Right, okay.
Exactly. We found approximately 100 listings, that is 100 pages offering hydroxychloroquine by different vendors. And the demand spiked, for example, when President Trump spoke about
Yes, of course. One thing, obviously, that I want to know is, are vaccines, or what pretend to be vaccines, appearing on the dark web? That surely is the most desirable resource of the moment. What are you seeing?
So that's a very good question. This study is titled Before the Vaccine, because we focused until November. We are checking at what's happening in the vaccine space right now. We have found indications. We are now waiting to get clearance from our partners to reveal all the data, but yeah, there is certainly attention also there.
That is very interesting. Well, listen, I think we need to get you back and talk more about that. That's interesting. The relations, I suppose it's just basic economics, isn't it, between the straight internet and the dark web as well. That was Andrea Baron-Kelly. That's it for Newsday. Lawrence and Claire saying thank you for joining us. BBC World Service, we're back again tomorrow.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and here's what's happening in the studio.
We meet one of the world's foremost lighting designers, Patrick Woodruff, OBE, as he rehearses with rock and pop superstars Genesis, illuminating the stage for their latest arena shows on this year's much-anticipated The Last Domino Tour.
In the studio at bbcworldservice.com/in-the-studio. And in half an hour, it's Business Daily.
Imagine signing up to work on a ship, expecting to be home after 9 months. Instead, nearly 2 years later, you're still at sea because coronavirus restrictions are preventing you from travelling home. We hear how that's just one of the crises affecting the global shipping industry.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up after the news on the BBC World Service, it's Hard Talk with me, Stephen Sacker. US-China relations will do much to shape the geopolitics of the 21st century, and it feels like the risk of long-term confrontation, even military conflict, is rising. From trade to Taiwan, the Trump administration talked tough on China, and an increasingly assertive Beijing responded in kind. Well, my guest is Evan Medeiros, President Obama's top advisor on the Asia-Pacific region. Is President Biden ready to break with his own past and take on China?
I think part of the Biden strategy is going to have to be aware of deterring China from moving toward greater military coercion of Taiwan, which has been happening in the last year. And, I hope that that's part of their strategy.
That's Evan Medeiros on Hard Talk after the news.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. Tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets in Myanmar for the third day in a row to protest against last week's military coup. Myanmar's elected leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, remains in detention since her government was ousted. Here's Jonathan Head.
Aung San Suu Kyi, who would have enormous authority, can't be heard from. She's in detention. And so it's being organised by local groups with a lot of student activists involved, with a very strong sense that they have to do this. When you listen to them, they're saying we can't allow history to be repeated. We cannot allow our country to go back to the days of military rule. A very harsh form of military rule for 50 years when it was completely isolated. There was terrible brutality. I mean, it was just a disaster. The numbers on the streets of Yangon right now are very, very big. The momentum has been building over the weekend, and if it isn't stopped, it's likely to keep on building.
Emergency workers are searching for as many as 200 people in the aftermath of the devastating flooding in the North Indian state of Uttarakhand. The state's chief minister said 11 bodies have now been recovered. A torrent of melted snow and ice swept down a valley, bursting through 2 hydroelectric dams and sweeping away bridges and homes. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has pleaded not guilty to charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust. He was making his second appearance in court since his trial began last May. Mr. Netanyahu denies having offered favours to media companies in exchange for positive coverage. The court hearing of Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister comes at a sensitive time, with the country set to hold its 4th general election in 2 years next month. Mr. Netanyahu's government coalition collapsed in December. The British government has sought to allay concerns about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, following preliminary research suggesting it was less effective against the South African coronavirus variant. The Vaccines Minister, Nadim Zahawi, said the Oxford research team remained confident the jab was effective in preventing severe illness, hospital admissions and deaths from that strain. Here's Fergus Walsh.
The current Pfizer and Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines work well against the dominant strain here in the UK, but there is concern about how much the South Africa variant may be spreading in the community. Over 100 cases have been identified, and other new variants are inevitable as the virus mutates. New vaccine technology means it is quick and simple to tweak COVID jabs. Scientists in Oxford are working on several updated vaccines, including ones against the South Africa and Brazil variants. Coronavirus mutates more slowly than flu, so it's too early to tell how often people would need a booster jab.
BBC News. Australia's Foreign Minister Marise Payne says the Australian journalist Chung has been formally arrested in China on suspicion of illegally supplying state secrets overseas. Chung worked as a high-profile presenter for China's state-run English-language news service, CGTN. She was detained in August last year. Mrs. Payne said the government has consistently raised its concerns about her detention.
We have made a number of consular visits to her as part of our bilateral consular agreement. The most recent of those was on the 27th of January, and we continue to seek assurances of her being treated appropriately, humanely, in accordance with international standards, and that will continue to be the case.
British lawyers assessing human rights abuses against the Uyghur people have said there's a very credible case that the Chinese government is committing genocide. They also thought that a case could be made against President Xi Jinping personally. James Landale reports.
Proving genocide is hard. You have to show somebody intended to destroy a group of people. But now a formal legal opinion has concluded that's what's happening in Xinjiang. Barristers from Essex Court Chambers in London were instructed by Uyghur and human rights groups to assess the publicly available evidence. They judged the deliberate infliction of harm on Uyghurs, the forcible transfer of children, and measures preventing women giving birth meant there's a very credible case China's government is committing genocide. The Chinese embassy in London said anti-China forces were fabricating lies of the century about Xinjiang.
And the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have beaten the Kansas City Chiefs by 31 points to 9 to win the Super Bowl. They were led to victory by the veteran quarterback Tom Brady. BBC News.
Welcome to Hard Talk on the BBC World Service with me, Stephen Sacker. For 6 years, my guest today was President Obama's top advisor on the Asia-Pacific region inside the National Security Council. In other words, Evan Medeiros played a crucial role in America's handling of the bilateral relationship that will do much to shape the geopolitics of the 21st century, that between Washington and Beijing. Mr. Obama famously declared that China's peaceful rise is good for the world and good for America. He and his team criticized Beijing on a range of trade and human rights issues, but the emphasis was on improving cooperation rather than intensifying hostility. But the Trump years have changed all that. From trade to Taiwan, the US has come to identify China as the key strategic threat, and the course appears to be set for an era of big power hostility, which could, quite conceivably, end in military conflict. How to handle China is now the central foreign policy challenge facing President Biden. So who will he borrow more from, Obama or Trump? Well, Evan Medeiros joins me now from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Hard Talk.
Great to be here, Stephen.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. We, in particular, want to tap into your experience. You were a very senior advisor to President Obama on China and wider Asia-Pacific region for several years. When you look back and you consider what is happening now in China and to US-China relations, can you say to me that President Obama actually got it wrong on China?
Well, as a former policymaker, hindsight is always 20/20. You can always look back and wish that you did things differently. I think when we look at President Obama's China policy, it's important to keep in mind that the first Chinese leader we had to deal with, Hu Jintao, was a very, very different leader than Xi Jinping. He was far less ambitious, he was far less aggressive, and he was far less willing to accept and tolerate risk and friction externally. So when I look back at our China policy, I wish that we had recognized quicker how different Xi Jinping was from Hu Jintao and recognized how he was going to take China politically, economically, and strategically in a different direction. Now, of course, once we recognized that beginning in 2015, U.S. policy started to harden substantially, including by ramping up efforts on multilateral trade agreements, working more with allies, and increasing military deployments to the region. But it simply took time to recognize what the leadership transition from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping meant strategically.
But in 2011, and this is before Xi Jinping took over both party and presidency, in 2011, Barack Obama said this, and it's very striking, the words he used. "I absolutely believe that China's peaceful rise is good for the world, and it is good for America." That sounds very naive to many American ears now.
Well, look, you make decisions at the time with the information available to you. And at that time, under the Hu Jintao administration, they were simply had a different set of priorities. They were much more interested in integrating with Asia, producing a stable, more cooperative relationship with the United States. The kind of ambition, ingression, use of capabilities that Xi Jinping adopted was simply different under Hu Jintao. So at that particular time, the U.S. strategy was still a combination of engage and hedge. And you got to remember, at 2011, we had adopted at that time the Asia Pivot strategy, which is about hedging all of the risk of a stronger, more assertive China. So even as he's talking about peaceful rise, he's building up alliances in the region.
Right, and you can pin a lot of the change on individuals and the rise of Xi Jinping, but nonetheless, Barack Obama wrote a memoir of his White House years very, very recently, Promised Land, and even in that, he's saying, that we avoided conflict with China. It was all about, he says, mutual respect and strategic patience between the two countries. And again, that's written, of course, in the last 12 months. I put it to you again that you and he perhaps misread what China really was intent on doing with its massive rise in economic power.
Again, Stephen, the Obama administration adopted the historic Asia-Pacific pivot, which was premised on building alliances and developing China in multilateral trade agreements. In other words, recognizing that China is getting bigger, it's getting stronger, its intentions might change, which obviously they did under Xi Jinping. So it's about adopting a more collective strategy for hedging, if not balancing, Chinese power, right? No other president did that. The pivot acknowledged and recognized the challenges associated with a rising China.
Right. But if we look at what is happening today, and we're going to go perhaps in some detail into what's happening in the South China Sea with China's aggressive actions in various islands in disputes with Japan and the Philippines. If we look at China's rhetoric on Taiwan, which is certainly hotting up. If we look at what China's doing in Hong Kong with its national security law, look right across the piece. Would you say today that Barack Obama's notion that China's rise is good for America, that's obsolete, that's junked, right?
Right, that's right. I mean, it comes down to what kind of rising power China will be. In the early Obama administration, under the leadership of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, there was still good reason to believe that a rising China would integrate more with current rules, norms, and institutions. And that changed, right? And this is the history of international politics. Leaders matter. And even though we were dealing with a different China under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, we still adopted the Asia Pivot strategy, a strategy of trying to create a more permissible environment for the United States and its allies and partners in Asia. So there was always a recognition of the downside risk. The question is, at what point and how quickly do you shift from a cooperative strategy to a competitive strategy? And sure, if you want me to say that I wish we had done things differently, absolutely. Again, hindsight is always 20/20. I wish that we had shifted more quickly to adopting a more competitive strategy. But these sort of big shifts in strategy take time, and you want to make sure that you really are understanding what's going on in China before you assume that risk and friction. And one other point, Stephen, on this. It's important to keep in mind that the rest of the world, if you think Obama was naive about China, let's take a look at the rest of the world. I mean, as a British program, you can fully appreciate that in 2015, George Osborne and David Cameron, your prime minister, were embracing China in the so-called golden era. George Osborne actually visited Xinjiang and praised Chinese policies in Xinjiang. And so I don't say that to criticize you in Britain, but just to explain that the rest of the world was far behind the United States in this recognition.
Listen, I'm in no way trying to play gotcha with you by trying to get you to say we got it wrong back in 2012 to 16.
Right.
I'm simply trying to understand what's going to happen now, because I'm very mindful, as you must be, that there are key players in Joe Biden's administration who were involved in developing China policy in the past, who are going to be developing China policy in the future. And the question is, what have they learned? How have they changed in the last few years? And I'll take one example, Kurt Campbell, who's now, I think, in effect, Asia policy chief in the National Security Council, a job very similar to the one you used to have. Now, Kurt Campbell, a couple of years ago, wrote a sort of mea culpa to a certain extent, saying that we have to do away with hopeful thinking. So are we now saying today that the Biden team buys into the tough approach that Donald Trump and his team took on China?
So it's important for your listeners to understand the choices facing policies are not soft or tough, right? It's a combination of a cooperative agenda and a competitive agenda. What's the mix? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 70-30? And that mix clearly had to change as we began to understand that Xi Jinping was taking China in a new and different direction. And the article that Kurt wrote was basically saying that the mix that we had used before, let's call it 50-50, 60-40, had not tilted enough in the direction of more competitive, risky strategies because China had become more ambitious and more assertive externally. And I think if you just listen to the Biden team, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and Kurt, when he starts publicly speaking, they've been very clear that they see China as a strategic competitor. If you look at the confirmation testimonies of most of the major cabinet members, Secretary of State, Defense, Treasury, they all identify China as a strategic competitor. They all talk about the various risks and challenges in the U.S.-China relationship, and then they talk about how the U.S. has to adopt a far more competitive strategy for doing so. So I actually think that Biden team has been very clear about
interesting. Even your choice of words just there is very interesting to me, because you talk about competitor, strategic competitor. You didn't use the word threat, but what we saw through the Trump years is increasingly the notion of threat being used with regard to China. I'm going to quote to you the testimony of the Army Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, in 2019 to the US Senate. He said, "I think China now is the primary challenge to US national security over the next 50 to 100 years, he said. Look at China's improving military. Very, very rapidly they're improving in space, air, cyber, maritime, land domains, outspending us in R&D and procurement." That was the Trump administration and its senior military officials essentially talking of China as a long-term, real military threat. Do you see that?
Yes, I agree with that assessment. And as you may know, General Milley continues to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he's advising President Biden just like he advised President Trump. So I think China threatens American economic interests, security interests, diplomatic interests in Asia, and increasingly globally.
And so when Rex Tillerson, for example, the Trump Secretary of State for at least some of the Trump administration, when he talked about China's island building in the South China Sea as akin to Russia's taking of the Crimea, we're going to have to send China a clear signal, the island building stops, and secondly, though the access by China to those islands is not going to be allowed, you were right behind that sort of, and you don't like the word tough because you think it's too simplistic, but that kind of approach to China is the one that you think Biden should adopt too, is it?
Well, that's different. I mean, what Secretary Tillerson was saying, and again, the quote that you have from him is from his confirmation testimony over 4 years ago, which he subsequently retracted and backed away from. What he said in that testimony was the United States should be prepared to go to war to defend the South China Sea. And I think that's a totally separate issue. I mean, the question is the South China Sea a vital American interest of the United States? Now, there are allies, in particular the Philippines, that have disputes with China over the South China Sea. And I think that protecting the credibility of America's alliance commitments is a vital interest. But whether or not the U.S. is prepared to go to war over the South China Sea, I think is a totally separate issue.
That's very interesting too, because you'll be very well aware that a real stir was caused in Washington just a couple of weeks ago with the publication by the Atlantic Council of an anonymous piece written by somebody who was described as a former senior government official with deep China expertise, saying that red lines must be established by the Biden administration. Red lines which should be short, focused, enforceable, and essentially involved any attack or blockade or hostile act, not only against U.S. forces, but against any U.S. ally in the region. Red lines. Do you believe Biden should be in the business right now, in the early days of administration, of setting out red lines to Beijing?
Well, what I do think is that the administration needs to distinguish between vital national interests, in other words, those interests that the U.S. is prepared to fight over, and interests that are, let's call them, very important. But the business of red lines is a complicated one because basically when you throw down a red line, you're essentially saying that this is a war and peace issue, and you're almost taunting your adversary to cross one of those red lines. So, the whole red line business, if it is an enterprise in distinguishing between vital interests and important interests, I think that's an important exercise. But trying to taunt your adversary, I think, is unwise and doesn't really serve any American interests or those of our allies or partners.
Right. It just strikes me in the course of this conversation, I'm picking up a sense in which you don't want to be drawn into rhetoric which is just out and out sort of confrontational. But Donald Trump did do that in several areas. He started in trade, and in the end he ended up with a trade deal which he claimed won some very serious concessions from China, and many independent observers agreed with him. Donald Trump's approach in some ways worked. Would you accept that?
Well, can you specify where it worked? I mean,
I just did, right, on trade.
But it's not true. I mean, the whole purpose of the trade deal was to shrink the U.S.-China trade deficit. The U.S.-China trade deficit is at all-time highs between the U.S. and China. Number two, the Phase 1 trade deal would set very specific benchmarks for Chinese purchases of American agricultural and energy goods over a 2-year time period. The Chinese, as of today, are still 40% short of their benchmark of purchases for the first year. So the Phase 1 trade deal didn't work. And as I'm sure you know, Stephen, the whole purpose of the trade negotiation when it was launched was to solve long-term structural issues in the U.S.-China trade relationship: IPR protection, forced technology transfer, Chinese state subsidies. The Phase 1 trade deal dealt with none of these issues. So to use your rhetoric, Stephen, the Trump strategy, yes, was very confrontational, pushback, prodding China at every opportunity, but it was not very competitive. It didn't improve the American competitive position vis-a-vis China. It was just very confrontational.
Right,
so
let's move on then. You don't see any real positives out of Trump's trade policy. What about his policy on Taiwan, where even in the last few weeks of his administration, the Trump administration was changing the diplomatic deal on Taiwan to ensure that the US would not accept any sort of protocols or limitations to its diplomatic outreach to Taiwan? Now, the Taiwanese, I'm sure, were thrilled. The Chinese were hugely infuriated. I'm just interested, again, as an Obama official, very close to the new team who is working with Joe Biden, do you think he should stick with the changes Trump made on Taiwan or not?
Well, what I think is interesting about Trump's Taiwan policy is that for the first 3 years of the administration, the Trump team did absolutely nothing on Taiwan, in large part because the president told them he doesn't care about Taiwan and doesn't want to do anything on Taiwan that would disrupt his ability to do a trade deal. Once the trade deal gets done in January of 2020, he then tells his team, you guys can do anything you want on Taiwan. So ignoring Taiwan for 3 years is a problem and sends the wrong signals to Beijing that you're willing to put U.S.-China relations above the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, which was totally different than the Obama administration. And I'm confident that the Biden team won't ignore Taiwan like the Trump team did. Now, when they finally did focus on Taiwan in their last year in 2020, they made some very significant and important arms sales to Taiwan, and I think that's good and important.
Yeah, because if I may interrupt you, the Obama team, I think it was maybe before you joined the team, but Obama had always refused to sell Taiwan the F-16 fighter planes, for example, that the Taiwanese wanted. So it is interesting to me that you now think it was right for Trump to sell significant arms to Taiwan.
Well, your understanding of the history is different than mine. The Obama administration very much wanted to sell F-16s to Taiwan. It was Taiwan that got sticker shock. The F-16s were simply too big and too expensive at the time. So what we agreed on was a compromise measure by which we would take the existing F-16s and upgrade them so their capabilities would actually be better than the ones they were going to purchase, which at that time was the most significant arms sales deal that the U.S. and Taiwan ever did. And we did that in the second year of the Obama administration. So arms sales are important and significant. I think Taiwan deserves dignity and respect. I think that the U.S. and Taiwan, under the Biden team, can and should think about new and creative ways to interact with one another. And so I'm hoping to see a much more vibrant and robust U.S.-Taiwan relationship, you know, with the existing one China policy. I think that can and probably will be done.
The Chinese have, in their first comments since Joe Biden took the White House, they've said that it is very important that Mr. Biden moves away from the language and the actions of confrontation and seeks cooperation. Do you think, for example, Joe Biden should therefore not do what the Trump administration did and emphasize that what they see in Xinjiang from the Chinese government is, to quote officials in the Trump administration, a policy of genocide and war crimes? Or should Joe Biden continue with that kind of language and on Hong Kong continue with the sanctions policy of sanctioning key Hong Kong officials deemed to be a part of the national security apparatus? I'm just trying to get a sense of whether you see continuity in those areas between Trump and Biden or not.
I think the Biden approach is going to be a mix of continuity and change from Trump. I mean, to put it in a sentence, I think that the Biden team is going to be far more competitive and less unnecessarily confrontational with China. I mean, the Trump team didn't actually accomplish that much with China.
Is calling what's happening to the Uyghurs genocide, is that unnecessarily confrontational?
The Biden team has already done that. I mean, the Secretary of State has said this multiple different times in public that he considers it a genocide. So the Biden team is on record. You know, I personally am very pleased and have been involved in discussions with British think tanks and the new China Research Council in the UK Parliament about how Britain can play a role in a more competitive strategy that's not, unnecessarily pugilistic. Because the reality is the whole world needs to get serious about what a long-term strategic competition between the US and China looks like.
Right. Just before we end, Rex Tillerson said that he thought war was a very real possibility. He believed that the trigger could well be Taiwan within the next 10 years. You study China all the time. You've worked in the US government advising on China. Is it your view too, given what you've told me about Xi Jinping and his ambitions and his assertiveness, is it your view too that war is a very real possibility?
I think on the issue of Taiwan, which is a war and peace issue for China, a conflict is certainly possible. There are probably lesser risks related to accidental or inadvertent conflict related to the South China Sea or the East China Sea. But the risk of conflict is there with Taiwan. Now, I believe that both sides have a variety of incentives not to allow the situation to escalate. And both sides are very steeped in the history of the Taiwan issue, but it remains extremely sensitive on both sides. And I think those risks are there. And I think part of the Biden strategy is going to have to be aware of deterring China from moving toward greater military coercion of Taiwan, which has been happening in the last year. And, I hope that that's part of their strategy.
Evan Medeiros, it is no doubt an issue we will revisit, but we have to end there. I thank you very much indeed for joining me on Hard Talk. Thank you.
This is the BBC World Service, looking ahead to World Radio Day.
We may live in the digital alive.
Worldwide Waves, Sunday at 14 GMT.
And all around me, shipping containers are being picked up and hauled around by a busy network of cranes, tractors and trucks, each of them containing commodities like steel or wheat or any number of consumer goods. Being mostly a landlubber, I've seen more shipping containers repurposed into shared office space, But the goods I use every day almost certainly travelled to me over the sea in a cargo ship. But usually container ships and the job they do are invisible to most of us, just humming along in the background, bringing goods from faraway factories to local stores and warehouses, ready for us to buy. During the pandemic, though, international supply chains have been hugely disrupted. Goods that we expect to be ready for us whenever we want them are being held up by a shortage of empty containers in Asia and backlogs in ports from Auckland to LA. The people who work on those ships have also had their lives turned upside down. Since governments closed borders due to the coronavirus last year and airlines cancelled most passenger flights, hundreds of thousands of seafarers have been stranded at sea or in foreign ports, unable to return home. The situation was improving, but the emergence of nukes supposed to finish 9 months later. Instead, nearly 2 years later, he's still stranded at sea. He spoke to me from on board his ship, which is currently sailing off the west coast of the US.
Now I start 21 months now. I joined on this ship in Rotterdam in Europe.
Why can't you go home?
The ship I work on was in the shipyard in Thailand, in China. The company, they say it's very difficult to send me to my country in China because of some paperwork in China is very difficult for me. And then after that, coming news that my country closed, and also New Zealand, because normally everywhere we go in this world, we must be passed through New Zealand and then we go to my country.
So what does it feel like being away for so long?
For me, to my point of view as a seaman, and this is my first time, this is a very hard time for me. Every night I cannot sleep. It's hard to sleep because I feel like I don't know when. But I miss my family so much, especially my wife and my daughter. I come from home, my wife, 4 months pregnant. And now my daughter is about 1 year old and 4 months now. And she didn't see me.
So you've never met your daughter?
Yeah, that's the worst part of my life. I'm stuck here. But for now, my country already have some special flight to go back home. Because this is the special flight my government keep for seamen to bring back home. But I asked to my captain or my master and they to find some way, but it's very hard for me to get this flight.
Yeah, you need to get to where the flight is leaving from. Where are you now?
For now on, we are on Pacific Ocean. We just come from China and then we go to cross the Pacific Ocean and we go to Long Beach in America.
Are you getting paid all this time you're on the ship?
But that's the good thing with this company. They continually pay me as normal as I am on this ship.
In Copenhagen, and we've been helping them in Hamburg as well, where we've got people.
That's Ian Stokes from Stella Maris, a charity dedicated to supporting those who work at sea.
We provide a friendly face in a foreign port, if you like. We are an international, worldwide charity that assists seafarers of any nationality, of any faith, creed, colour around the world, wherever and whenever they need help.
And you send on goods to help the seafarers, things they might need.
We gave out thousands of Christmas packages over the seasonal period. Sometimes the SIM cards we can pass over at the quayside. Sometimes they lower a bucket on a rope down the side of the ship and we stick it in the bucket and they hoist it back up and it's done that way.
Tell us then what you're hearing in your work, across your network, from those seafarers that are still stranded. What kind of struggles are they going through during this long period away from home and away from their families?
If you think these guys, they should be on the ship 6 to 9 months. Some are now on 15, 18, 21 months on board a ship. And that's their workplace, that's their home, that's their exercise, and other things as well. What if they need the doctor? What if they need the dentist? That perhaps the worst thing is the continued uncertainty. They don't mind a bit of delay, but as long as they can say, well, I'm being delayed for 2 weeks and I'll be going home on February the 22nd. But no one can say that to them, I'm afraid. A lot of them are in limbo. That's the thing that eats away at them.
Similar problems have affected the cruise ship industry. The virus has, of course, meant cruises have been cancelled, But these huge machines need to be maintained, even without guests. That means a skeleton crew of staff are on board, keeping engines running. But they've also had difficulty returning home when their contracts came to an end. Martel Furston works for Holland America, part of the Carnival Cruise Line. She explains